Hi Year 11 and welcome to OCR History B Making of America 1789 to 1900 content videos. This video will cover theme 4, which is Settlement and Conflict on the Plains 1861 to 1877. A reminder then of our timeline for the Making of America. We have 5 themes throughout the course and you need to know the dates of these confidently, as the questions will always have dates attached and your evidence needs to be applicable to the question. On the timeline that you can see, the presidents for each time period are in red at the bottom of the timeline. Remember, you don't need to know all of these presidents, but you do need to know the names of those who passed key legislation. The first theme on the America paper is America's expansion. So why did America expand? What caused that to happen? And this time period has the date 1783 to 1838. The second time period is the West. Why did the people begin to migrate to the far west of America? And the dates for this time period are 1839 to 1860. Period 3 has 2 themes within it, and they are the American Civil War, which has been covered in the previous video, and settlement and conflict on the plains, which is the focus for this one. It's really important that you know that these 2 themes run alongside one another and that the dates for both theme 3 and 4 are 1861 to 1877. And the final theme for the Making of America is American cultures, and the final dates for that are 1877 to 1900. Within our 4th theme, one of the topics is the construction and the impact of the railroad. So firstly, it's important to know as a date that the Transcontinental Railroad opens in 1869. So please make sure that you're confident with this date. And as we said, that means that it fits into this 4th theme. So on the mind map, the information that is in purple is to do with the railroad's construction, and the information that comes up in red is to do with the impact. So first of all, you need to know that it is Abraham Lincoln who passes the Pacific Railroad Act. Remember, we said that on the timeline there are lots of presidents and you need to know some of them. Lincoln is absolutely one of those presidents. So the Pacific Railroad Act stated that the US government would provide money for any companies willing to make a railroad linking the eastern and western halves of the country. The US government also offered the railroad companies free land on either side of the track, which could then be sold to settlers. So this is an incentive for these railroad companies because not only are they kind of getting publicity in terms of the construction of the railroad, but they're also able to make a lot of money by selling land. The bold bit at the bottom that you can see states that the railroad would make it easier for migrants to travel to the far west, but would also allow white Americans to start farming on the plains. So this is kind of linked to impact. This is the reason why we start to see more migrants moving, but we need to know the date of the act and what it actually stated. Secondly, we've got as the American Civil War was coming to an end, the American government could pump more money into the creation of the railroads because they're not spending as much on military. In 1864, over $50 million was made available to encourage companies to build. The companies received 6,400 acres of land for every mile of track they built. And then we have the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific companies, who are the companies who get the contract to begin to build. So again, it would be good, those of us going for 7s, 8s and 9s, to know the statistics here if we were talking about railroad construction for how much land the companies received, and that would enable them to make a lot more money. So as we said, a huge incentive. Also, in terms of construction, we need to know diversity potentially of the people that were employed. So we had 12,000 Chinese migrants who were employed to do the dangerous work of tunnelling through the rocks of the Rocky Mountains. Men worked 6 days a week in extreme weather and lived in tents. The sanitation was poor and disease was common. So again, if you had a 9-mark question, which was in reference to the railroads, you could absolutely speak about diversity with the kind of migrants that we had working on the construction of the railroad and also the conditions that they were living in. So in terms of the impact of the railroads, firstly, unsurprisingly, there was a huge impact on Native Americans. Railroads divided up the land where the natives had hunted buffalo. Cattle towns intruded on the vast areas of grassland needed for the natives to follow the buffalo, and this led to violent clashes between the natives and the white Americans. So I'm sure none of us are surprised by this, but that is absolutely a point that you could write. Cow towns also emerged on the plains. You'll see right at the end of this information, I've put Abilene in bold font for you. It's always good to have an example, and Abilene is the one that you would go for if you were talking about the cow towns. Remember, these were very unruly places where cowboys would drink in saloons, gamble, sleep with prostitutes, and engage in violence. So again, another solid example of the impact of the railroads, obviously a negative impact here. It's also a negative impact for the Native Americans. And finally, we have cattle ranches. So driving cattle from southern Texas to cow towns made little sense, and so cattlemen began to rear cattle on the plains themselves. The ranches were open as the cattlemen did not use fences, and this led to a scarcity of water and grass for the buffalo herds. So again, this is a negative impact as a result of the railroads, as a result of people moving to the west. We begin to see the land again taken from the natives. It's being used differently and it impacts on their nomadic lifestyle. So this is the information that you need to know for the railroads in terms of construction and impact. Something that I meant to add on the previous slide is that the Transcontinental Railroad, just remember, connects the east coast of America and the west coast of America. And remember that Lincoln encourages this to be built in the northern half of the United States. Sorry, I should have added that on the previous slide, so just a reminder about that. So moving on then to homesteaders and farmers on the plains. So first of all, helpfully, Lincoln also releases in 1862, so the same year as his Railroad Act, something called the Homestead Act. So you need to know what a homesteader is, and you need to know what the Act promised. So the Act promised people 160 acres of plains land if they farmed it for a full 5 years and paid a small fee. Women were also allowed to apply as well as men, and it was an attractive opportunity for many to own their own land for a very small price. So this is a really important piece of legislation. Remember, we spoke about the fact that you do need to know certain presidents that introduced certain legislation, and Lincoln's Homestead Act is one example of this. So in terms of reasons for people moving to the plains, railroad companies were a big factor in this because they produced lots of propaganda, which made the plains look like a desirable place to move to. And this then allowed them to sell and remember that they'd been promised for building the track to migrants and to make a profit. So they make lots of propaganda that makes the plains look like a really desirable place to be. And they also make it seem like farming there would be very, very easy. We know that that's not the reality, but this is one of the reasons why people began to move. Land was also very, very expensive in the east, and California and Oregon were desirable places in the west, but they were also very expensive. Land on the plains, however, was really cheap, and this again encouraged lots of white Americans to move west to become a homesteader, to gain land and fulfill their dreams of becoming independent farmers. So if you had a question on why homesteaders were moving west, you can speak about the railroad company's propaganda and the fact that the land was so much cheaper. In terms of the challenges on the plains, because farming there wasn't easy, so one of the challenges, for example, was a lack of water. So in winter, water froze, and in summer there was drought. So this meant there was less water for them to drink, but also to use on their crops as well. So some of the solutions that they came up with was dry farming. So this involved ploughing a thin layer of topsoil following heavy rain. They also drilled deep into the ground to build a wind pump to bring the water back to the surface, and they also grew turkey red wheat from Russia, which could withstand the frost and could be used in the winter, which obviously didn't require the same amount of water either. So there are additional problems and solutions, such as difficulty ploughing the land with the solution of sod busters, or fencing the land with the solution of barbed wire, and you can refer to page 138 of your revision guide for more examples of this. So you might be asked about the homesteaders. If it was a 9-mark question, for example, and you were providing an analysis, you could speak about the consequences of moving there, and some of the challenges and solutions would fit into your analysis of that. So, as I say, page 138 of your revision guide for additional examples. So the reality of the plains, as I've said, was very different from the promise. Although the homesteaders got to own their own land and farm there were many, many challenges once they arrived, and conflict with the natives was only going to get worse alongside all of the farming difficulties that they faced. We've spoken about the fact that there were lots of white Americans flooding to the plains due to the railroads predominantly. and the fact that that brought conflict with it in terms of the natives. So in terms of this question of why there was so much bloodshed on the plains, first of all, there were now ecological tensions. So there was now mass competition for both land and water on the plains from the natives and the homesteaders and the cattle ranchers. And as a result of this, there was obviously going to be violence and aggression shown due to the fact that there is so much competition now for land and water. In terms of hardening attitudes, there were scientific theories of race within the United States that, in the opinion of the scientists that had produced those theories, they believed that many white Americans were superior and that natives were inferior. And therefore, white Americans taking the natives' land was seen as something that was natural because the natives were not equal to that white Americans. So there were scientific theories of race that were really strongly believed. We also had the US government signed many treaties with different tribes which pushed them onto reservations, which were small areas of land, and lots of tribes struggled to survive here. They were reliant on rations. They had to convert their way of life to farming rather than the nomadic lifestyle that they were used to in terms of following the buffalo. So this was very, very challenging for them. So reservations would be something that you would reference in this theme in the exam, and you need to know what they are and the fact that the natives had to change their whole way of life if they were to survive on the reservation. And finally, guns and fear. So by the 1850s, owning handguns was completely normal. So those of us going for 7s, 8s and 9s in the exam, a real specific that we could refer to is Winchester's repeating rifles. These were sold to hunters, farmers and local militia and natives alike. So the company weren't bothered who they were selling the guns to, it was just enabling them to make as much money as possible. But this leads to lots and lots of Americans owning handguns for the first time. Also, the American Civil War had led to increased gun ownership, and by 1865, 1/3 of households owned at least one gun. Obviously, this is going to lead to more extreme violence if a violent attack breaks out because of the fact that more people now have access to guns. It's quite unlikely that you would be given a question specifically on the Indian Wars, but you could be asked a question that centres around conflict between natives and white Americans during this time period. And if that was the case, you do need to be able to reference some of the Indian Wars. Now, I am going to go through this information quite quickly, and it's really important to stress you do not need to remember every single detail here. But you've got these notes in your book. You've also got your revision guide to aid you with this. And as we go through, just think of the ones that you remember and the ones that you would like to reference in the exam if you were speaking about the fact that actually the tension between the natives and the white Americans was very, very high during this time period. So firstly, we have Little Crow's War, 1861 to 1862. So the cause of this is that the Sioux were refused food and the government wouldn't open emergency stores. So remember, we said that lots of the tribes were reliant on rations, and these emergency stores would not be opened. So this is leading to desperation. In terms of the actions, I'm sure we can understand why the Sioux reacted in this way. So they attack 500 settlers who were slaughtered. And the consequence for this is that Little Crow was beheaded and scalped and put on display. So 300 Sioux were put on trial, 38 were hanged, and hundreds were imprisoned. So if we can clearly see here that the American government do not tolerate the violence that was shown by groups such as the Sioux. So it would be good for you to reference the extreme consequences that were given to the tribe. We then have the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. So we had lots of gold miners who were moving to Cheyenne and Arapahoe in Colorado, and they were pushing the Indian tribes out as a result of this. They didn't have enough food, so they began hunting in the mining areas, and some also attacked white settlers. So this is in relation to the fact that the Indian land again once is being encroached upon. So therefore we have a violent reaction from the tribe. So a man named Chivington was put in charge of dealing with the Indian threat. So he's a white American, and he kills 105 Cheyenne women and children and 28 men. They cut scalps and genitalia from the corpses of those people that they had killed from the tribe, and these became trophies. So Colorado as a place celebrated initially the fact that the natives had been treated so badly. They were pleased that the threat had been removed, and there was actually a parade for Chivington's men who rode through the streets with scalps hanging from their belts. However, because of the extreme reaction that Chivington gave, the government do launch an investigation. 6 of Chivington's men were arrested, and Chivington was made to resign from the army. So we can clearly see here that the government are aware that perhaps Chivington's actions were too extreme. We then have Red Cloud's War between 1865 and 1868. This was due to the discovery of gold in Montana, and it led to a war between the Lakota Sioux and the US Army. A gold mining trail had been put right through the Sioux land. Remember, we've spoken about the fact that these tribes are nomadic, so this was obviously limiting the room that the buffalo had. The actions of this, the Lakota Sioux began attacking the travellers along the Bozeman Trail, and Red Cloud and Crazy Horse also attacked US Army forts. Captain Fetterman's 80 troops were all killed, scalped and mutilated by the Sioux. We can understand these actions because of the tribe desiring revenge for what happened during the Sand Creek Massacre, and Red Cloud continued to achieve victories over the US government. In terms of the consequence, the US government had to sign a treaty at Fort Laramie, which granted a vast amount of land to the Sioux, including the Black Hills of Dakota. And remember, the Black Hills were really significant to the Lakota Sioux because this is where so many of their ancestors were buried, so it was seen as sacred land. So this Fort Laramie Treaty would be a really good specific to use in the exam. And you can remember that it grants the Sioux, the Black Hills of Dakota. It assures the Indians that the US troops won't enter their lands again without permission. So clearly here we can see that the tribe have scared really the American government into reacting and handing over land in the hope that there won't be any more violent conflict between the two. We have the Great Sioux War, which ran between 1875 and 1877. A cause once again is the fact that gold has been found, and sadly for the Lakota Sioux, it is found in their sacred land of the Black Hills of Dakota. So despite the US government promising to ban people from going into the Sioux land, when gold is discovered, many miners begin to turn up. In terms of actions, the government offered to buy the Black Hills for $6 million, but Sitting Bull refused. The government were furious and ordered Sioux troops back into reservation forts. In 1876, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse wiped out a US Army camp by the Rosebud River and set up camp on the Little Bighorn River. Crazy Horse also attacked the advancing army of General Crook, and the US soldiers were heavily defeated. So we see here military action from the Lakota Sioux, and we see the fact that they actually managed to defeat an army of US soldiers. The consequence is that the Indian tribes retreat back to the Little Bighorn River, and that's where they essentially dig in. We also have, as part of the Great Sioux War, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which is in 1876. So this is a battle to know about within the Great Sioux War. And we had General Custer, who was part of the US Army. He had been ordered to find Sitting Bull's army and drive them towards the main group of soldiers. In terms of action, 6,000 Indians were camped on the Little Bighorn River. Custer attacked with the 210 men, leaving himself outnumbered 4-1. Many white American weapons overheated or jammed, and Custer and all of his men were killed. So this looks like it was a huge victory for the natives. However, the war as a whole, so the Great Sioux War, could not be won as much as the Battle of the Little Bighorn was a victory for the natives. And the reason that it could not be won is because the US Army prevented the Indians getting supplies. So the overall kind of consequence is that Crazy Horse was killed, and that the Sioux end up surrendering the Black Hills, those sacred lands to them, and 40 million acres of other land that they owned. So overall, we can see there is lots and lots of bloodshed as a result of the Indian Wars. And if you were given a question on whether or not it was peaceful or violent methods, for example, during this time period, you could absolutely use some of the Indian War evidence to support your arguments. a number of past paper questions from the third time period and the fourth theme of Making of America, settlement and conflict on the plains, 1861 to 1877. So have a go at some of these questions as part of your revision. Use the video on how to answer the exam questions for Making of America to support you as you write. And the next video in the series for the Making of America will again be on the fourth and final time period, American cultures, 1877 to 1900.